Boston, on a crisp autumn morning, looked picture perfect. Brick sidewalks lined with red and orange leaves. Students in navy and white uniforms laughing as they rushed through the gates of one of the city's oldest high schools. But inside a small nurse's office at the end of a quiet hallway, the world was falling apart. 18-year-old senior Amara Lewis sat on a hard plastic chair, clutching a single sheet of paper. Her fingers shook as her eyes ran over the words again and again. HIV positive. It wasn't the scream she thought she would let out. It wasn't even the tears. What came first was a crushing silence, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She remembered nothing about how she left the nurse's office. Just the way the school nurse looked at her, half pity, half fear, like Amara had instantly become someone different, someone untouchable. Outside, she could still hear the carefree laughter of her classmates, and it felt like a sound from another planet. Until that moment, Amara believed she had a future worth dreaming about. She was smart, artistic, the kind of student teachers praised even if she didn't always fit in with her peers. She loved sketching Boston's skyline in winter, her pencil capturing clouds and rooftops as if they could explain the loneliness she carried. She had even been preparing college applications to art schools in New York. Freedom, escape, that was what she dreamed of. But one medical test had reduced all of that to ashes. That evening, she walked home through streets that suddenly felt colder. Her mother, Clara Lewis, was waiting in their small apartment kitchen, the same woman who had raised her alone, juggling 2 and sometimes 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. To Amara, Clara had always been the symbol of strength. But under the dim yellow light that night, Clara looked like someone hiding a wound that had never healed. And then came the truth. Amara hadn't just contracted HIV. She had been born with it. The revelation was a knife to the gut. Clara confessed that nearly 2 decades ago, she had been raped while working a late shift. She had carried the pregnancy, terrified, and then buried the truth about the virus under a lifetime of silence. Every vitamin she had forced Amara to swallow, every secret doctor's visit, every long night of whispered phone calls suddenly made sense. Amara's whole childhood replayed itself in her mind. Only now she could see the cracks. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her silence was sharper than glass. In that moment, the bond between mother and daughter fractured. What she felt wasn't only sorrow, it was betrayal. That night, lying awake in her tiny bedroom, staring at the cracked ceiling, Amara realized that her life had never truly belonged to her. At 18, she should have been thinking about prom night, graduation, maybe even falling in love. Instead, she could only think about the invisible sentence written into her blood. A slow death, a stolen future. And the longer she thought about it, the more her grief hardened into something darker. Anger. She was angry at her mother for the lies, angry at fate for robbing her of innocence before she even knew what innocence was. But most of all, she was angry at the world that pretended to be righteous, that wrapped itself in the language of morality and authority while hiding its rot underneath. Boston High was supposed to be a place of honor, but Amara had seen enough to know it wasn't. She'd overheard whispers about Mr. Dalton, the English teacher who texted girls a little too often, about Coach Miller's wandering eyes in the locker room, about Principal Carter's rumored relationships with students that no one dared to talk about. Even Ms. Vega, the art teacher who preached about living authentically, had her own secrets. To Amara, these were no longer rumors. They were proof that the people who claimed to be protectors were nothing more than hypocrites. And so, as the city settled into its restless night, Amara opened her laptop. The screen glowed against her darkened room as she began to type into a blank document. It wasn't homework. It wasn't an essay. It was a plan, a vow. If she had been cursed with this disease, she would turn it into her weapon. She wouldn't lash out at strangers. No, her targets would be the very people society had trusted the most. Her teachers, her mentors, the authority figures who believed themselves untouchable. Her revenge wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be messy. It would be silent, patient, like the virus in her veins. Outside, a police siren wailed somewhere in the distance. carried through her cracked window by the cold wind. Amara felt her lips curve into a smile even she didn't recognize. Gone was the quiet, dreamy girl who once thought art could save her. In her place stood someone new, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to destroy. And Boston High had no idea what was coming. Clara Lewis had always been a woman of few words. To her neighbors in their cramped Boston apartment building, she was the dependable single mom who worked herself to the bone, smiled politely in the hallways, and never caused trouble. To Amara, she was the anchor, the one person who never left, who kept the lights on and the fridge stocked even if it meant working double shifts. But behind that steel exterior, Clara carried a secret so heavy that it bent her back with every passing year. She was only 19 when her life had been stolen from her. One night, after finishing a late shift at a diner near Roxbury, Clara took the long walk home. It was early spring, damp and cold, the kind of night when even the streetlights looked tired. She never made it. A man dragged her into a dark alley, and by the time she stumbled home hours later, she was bloodied, broken, and carrying a burden she hadn't chosen. Weeks later, the pregnancy test came back positive. The world around her offered no comfort. When she told her mother, the older woman clutched her chest and cried, but insisted Clara carry the baby. The police report led nowhere. Too little evidence, too many excuses. And when the blood test came back with the word HIV, Clara felt the earth crack open beneath her. This wasn't just trauma. It was a life sentence. At first, she considered an abortion. She sat in a clinic, trembling, filling out the forms. But when a nurse called her name, Clara froze. She placed a hand on her flat belly, and despite the horror that had brought her there, she felt a flicker of something. Fear, yes, but also a stubborn will to protect what was hers. She walked out of that clinic and never went back. That choice, one of desperation and defiance, sealed both her fate and Amara's. Raising a child while hiding the truth was like living a double life. Clara became an expert at secrecy. She invented stories about doctor's appointments, about the vitamins Amara needed to take when she was young, about why she was stricter than other parents when it came to blood tests and medical checkups. She convinced herself she was protecting her daughter, that if Amara never knew, maybe she could have something resembling a normal childhood. But the weight of silence was unbearable. There were nights when Clara sat at the kitchen table after a long shift, staring at the bottles of antiretroviral medication lined up beside the salt and pepper shakers. She thought about telling Amara, then stopped herself. How could she look into those innocent eyes and confess that her daughter's blood carried the shadow of her own violation? That every scraped knee, every fever was not just childhood, it was a reminder of the violence that had shaped both of their lives. Amara grew up watching her mother cry quietly in the bathroom, pretending she had soap in her eyes. She watched her mother avoid dating, avoid even the possibility of love, as if romance was a luxury she no longer deserved. Clara told herself that the sacrifices were worth it, that her daughter would at least have a chance. But deep down, she knew it was a house built on lies. And then came the moment when the truth slipped out, not because Clara was ready, but because the test results forced her hand. Sitting at that kitchen table with Amara staring at her, demanding answers, Clara's carefully built walls crumbled. She told her daughter about that night so many years ago, about the man whose face she couldn't forget no matter how many times she tried to scrub it from her memory. She told her about the pregnancy, about the test results, about the decision she made to keep the baby despite knowing what it meant. Every word was like pulling glass out her throat. Clara expected tears, maybe even forgiveness. What she saw instead was worse. Silence. Amara didn't scream, didn't collapse. She just looked at her mother with eyes that no longer belonged to a child. Eyes filled with betrayal. Clara wanted to explain. She wanted to say she hadn't meant for this to happen, that she thought she was giving her daughter life instead of stealing it. She wanted to beg for understanding, to say she was sorry every single day for what she'd passed down. But the words caught in her chest. For the first time since the night of the assault, Clara felt truly powerless. In the days that followed, she tried to reach Amara. She cooked her favorite meals, left notes on her bedroom door, whispered prayers into the silence. But Amara didn't respond. The girl who had once laughed while sketching at the kitchen table now shut her door and stared at the ceiling for hours. Clara told herself that maybe, in time, her daughter would understand. Maybe love was strong enough to heal even this. But deep down, she feared the truth. Secrets don't protect. They corrode. And by hiding the truth for 18 years, she hadn't spared Amara's pain. She had multiplied it. Clara didn't know it yet, but her silence had lit a fire in her daughter's heart. A fire that would soon consume not just Amara's life, but the lives of others who had no idea what storm was coming. The days after her mother's confession felt like walking through a dream, except it wasn't the kind you woke up from. Amara drifted through the hallways of Boston High, her backpack heavy on her shoulders, her face unreadable. She still turned in assignments, still raised her hand in class, but everything felt hollow, like she was playing the role of a student instead of living as one. Every smile she saw from her peers looked fake. Every lecture from her teachers sounded like noise. She no longer belonged here. She no longer belonged anywhere. At night, she sat in front of her mirror, staring at her reflection as though trying to recognize the girl staring back. The wide brown eyes, the full lips, the hair she used to braid neatly every Sunday night. All of it felt foreign, like she was wearing someone else's face. She wasn't Amara Lewis, senior student with college dreams. She was Amara Lewis, born with a virus that made her body a weapon. A girl carrying the sins of a crime she never asked for. The bitterness grew quickly, feeding on itself. In class, when Mr. Dalton smiled at her, with that too soft, too interested look, she wanted to laugh. He thought he was in control, the respectable English teacher adored by parents and trusted by the principal. But Amara saw through him now. She saw through all of them. Authority figures who thought their titles and reputations made them untouchable. They carried their own secrets, their own weaknesses, their own appetites. And she could expose it all. It started as a fantasy. Sitting alone at her desk, she imagined watching them squirm. Mr. Dalton's perfect career collapsing under the weight of scandal. Coach Miller, with his sculpted muscles and cocky grin, realizing that strength couldn't save him. Ms. Vega, the art teacher who preached about honesty but lived her own hypocrisy. Even Mr. Adissa, the history teacher drowning in a failing marriage, hiding behind lessons of morality he didn't practice himself. And at the top of it all, Principal Carter, the man with whispers swirling around him for years, who had built an empire of discipline on lies. Amara thought of each of them as masks, and she would be the one to rip those masks away. What had once been despair began to harden into something else. Purpose. For the first time since reading those 3 words on the test result, she felt clarity. She couldn't control the past. She couldn't erase what was in her blood, but she could choose what to do with it. If life had already written her off, why not write her own ending? Her transformation was subtle at first. A new confidence in the way she walked down the hall. A sharper edge in her smile when teachers praised her work. Friends noticed she laughed less, but when she did, the sound had a strange, hollow quality. Even Clara saw it. Her daughter, once soft-spoken, now carried herself with a calm defiance that scared her. But Amara brushed it off. "I'm fine," she would say, though she never meant it. Inside, a storm was brewing. She began studying people the way she used to study paintings, observing every line, every flaw, every hidden detail. She learned when Dalton stayed late grading papers. She noticed how Miller lingered after practice, showering alone. She watched Vega, who thought her secret admiration of female students went unnoticed. She saw Adissa's hands tremble whenever he removed his wedding ring during lunch breaks. And she memorized the way Carter closed his office blinds during meetings that lasted just a little too long. Knowledge was power, and Amara was collecting it piece by piece, sketching their sins in her mind like a new series of portraits. Only this time, the canvas wasn't paper. It was their lives. At 18, most girls dreamed about dresses for prom, college acceptances, or first loves. Amara's dreams were darker. She dreamed of revenge not as fire and fury, but as something slower, colder, like poison in the bloodstream. She didn't need to scream, didn't need to fight. All she had to do was wait for them to reach out, to give in to their own weaknesses. She would be there, ready to pull them under. The quiet, studious girl had vanished. In her place stood someone sharper, more dangerous. Someone who had nothing left to lose. Amara Lewis was no longer a victim. She was a hunter, and the hunt was about to begin. Mr. Dalton was the kind of teacher parents loved. He was in his mid-30s, neatly dressed in collared shirts and cardigans, always carrying a worn leather briefcase that smelled faintly of old books. He had a way of quoting poetry in class that made some students roll their eyes, but left others hanging on every word. To the outside world, he was the model of respectability, kind, approachable, even charming. But Amara had noticed the little things. The way his compliments to female students sometimes lingered a beat too long. The late-night emails with no real reason other than to check in. The way his gaze sometimes drifted when he thought no one was looking. Amara chose him as her first. It began innocently enough. After class one day, she stayed behind, her sketchbook clutched her chest. "Mr. Dalton," she said softly, "would you look at this poem I wrote? I don't know if it's any good." Her voice carried just the right amount of vulnerability. She watched his eyes light up. Here was a teacher who prided himself on being the mentor, the confidant, the one students trusted with their secrets. He leaned closer, reading the words she had carefully crafted to be raw, confessional, almost seductive. His praise was immediate, his hand brushing hers as he handed the notebook back. From there, the trap set itself. She began staying after class more often, asking for his thoughts, laughing at his jokes, letting silences stretch just long enough to make the air heavy. Dalton, for all his education, never realized she was leading him step by step into the very place he'd sworn he would never go. One Friday afternoon, she told him she was struggling with her college essays. "Maybe you could come by my house," she suggested, her tone casual, her eyes lowered as though embarrassed by the request. Dalton hesitated, but not for long. He told himself it was just tutoring, that he was helping a student who trusted him. That evening, he showed up at the small apartment where Clara was conveniently working a late shift. The living room smelled faintly of incense, a trick Amara had learned from watching old movies. Set the mood, blur the lines. She offered him tea, sat close enough on the couch that their knees brushed. At first, Dalton tried to talk about essays, about themes and metaphors, but the words tangled in his throat as Amara leaned in. She wasn't forceful. She didn't need to be. She let him believe he was making the choice, that his desire was the one guiding the moment. And when the line was finally crossed, there was no going back. Afterward, Dalton sat on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands. He mumbled something about mistakes, about how this could never happen again. Amara simply watched him, her face unreadable. Then, with the calmness of someone discussing the weather, she whispered, "You should probably know something about me." When the words left her lips, "I'm HIV positive," Dalton froze. For a moment, he thought she was joking, some twisted attempt at dark humor. But the look in her eyes told him otherwise. His face drained of color. He stammered, asked if she was serious, if this was some kind of test. Amara didn't answer. She just stood, picked up her sketchbook, and began drawing as though nothing had happened. The silence was suffocating. Dalton left quickly after that, his hands trembling so badly he dropped his car keys on the way out. Driving home, every red light seemed to last an eternity. He replayed the night in his head, searching for excuses, for reasons it couldn't be true. But the truth clung to him like smoke. He imagined his wife finding out, the school board, the parents. His career, his whole life, teetered on the edge of ruin. For Amara, it was the first taste of victory. She lay back on her bed that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling something she hadn't felt in weeks: control. Dalton had thought himself powerful, untouchable. Now he was hers, bound not by chains, but by fear. She didn't need to expose him publicly. Not yet. His own conscience, his own paranoia, would do the work for her. The next Monday in class, Dalton couldn't meet her eyes. His voice shook when he read passages from Whitman, his hands sweaty as he turned the pages. Amara sat in the front row, her face serene, her gaze steady, knowing that every word he spoke was haunted by the memory of that night. She didn't need to say a thing. And just like that, the game had begun. Coach Miller was the kind of man who never had to try hard to get attention. Young for a faculty member, only 28, with a chiseled jawline and a body built from years of basketball and weight training, he was the figure every boy on the team wanted to be and every girl in the stands whispered about. He carried himself with the swagger of someone who knew the eyes were always on him. His smile was quick, his voice confident, and his authority in the gym unquestioned. But Amara had learned that confidence could also be a crack in the armor. And Miller's crack was his ego. She began showing up at the gym more often after school, sketchbook in hand, pretending to work on art projects while the team practiced. At first, Miller barely noticed her. But when she lingered longer than the other students, when she caught his eye from the bleachers with a look that lasted just a beat too long, he started to take notice. After practice one evening, when the rest of the team had already left, he called out to her. "You always here this late?" he asked, tossing a basketball from hand to hand. Amara gave him a small smile. "I like the quiet. Easier to think." She closed her sketchbook slowly, deliberately. "Besides, you don't seem to mind." That was all it took. A challenge wrapped in innocence. Miller smirked, the kind of grin that had probably gotten him into and out of trouble his whole life. He tossed the ball aside and leaned against the bleachers. "You're different from the others, you know. Most girls don't care about staying late unless they're trying to impress someone." "Maybe I am," she replied softly, her tone carrying just enough ambiguity to keep him hooked. The next few days, their conversations stretched longer. She let him do most of the talking, about the team, about his college days, about how teaching didn't pay enough for the hours he put in. He liked to talk about himself, and Amara listened, nodding, offering little remarks that made him feel seen. She knew exactly what she was doing. Men like Miller crave validation almost as much as they crave power. One rainy Thursday, after practice ended and the storm rattled against the gym windows, Miller invited her to hang out a little longer. The locker room lights were dim. The smell of sweat and damp went heavy in the air. Amara sat on a bench while he showered, the sound of water echoing through the tiled walls. When he emerged in a towel, she didn't flinch. Instead, she looked him in the eye, then looked away, just long enough to stir his confidence. He took it as an invitation. What happened next unfolded quickly, almost predictably. Miller crossed the line, and Amara didn't resist. She let it happen, let him believe he was in control, when in reality, every step had been orchestrated. He thought it was a secret tryst, a moment of weakness he could bury beneath his charm and authority. He didn't know he was walking straight into her trap. When it was over, Miller leaned back against the locker, grinning like a teenager who'd gotten away with something forbidden. "You can't tell anyone," he said, half laughing, half serious. Amara's response was calm, almost chilling. "You should probably know something about me," she whispered, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "I'm HIV positive." The grin fell from his face instantly. His eyes widened, his breath caught. He stared at her, waiting for her to say it was a joke, waiting for the punchline. But her expression didn't change. She simply picked up her sketchbook from the bench and walked toward the door, leaving him frozen, water still dripping from his hair. That night, Miller's world shifted. Alone in his apartment, he sat at the edge of his bed, replaying every second in his mind. His heart pounded as he thought about the future, the tests, the possibility of losing his job, his reputation, his health. For the first time in his life, the muscles, the charm, the confidence, none of it mattered. He was powerless. At school the next day, Miller tried to act normal. He barked orders at the team, joked in the hallways, but his eyes kept darting toward Amara whenever she appeared. She didn't look at him once. That silence was worse than anything she could have said. Every laugh from a passing student, every glance from another teacher made him paranoid. Did they know? Could they tell? Amara, sitting in the bleachers again with her sketchbook, sketched without looking up. She knew the fear was already working its way through him, like a poison he couldn't shake. Another mask had cracked. Another secret had turned into a weapon, and Amara wasn't finished. Not even close. Ms. Vega was different from the others. She didn't carry herself with arrogance like Dalton or the swagger of Miller. She was calm, collected, with an edge of confidence that came from knowing who she was. Mid-30s, with sharp cheekbones and hair cut short in a stylish bob, she dressed in flowing scarves and linen skirts, always smelling faintly of paint and sandalwood. She was the kind of teacher students felt safe around, the one who encouraged them to express their truth on canvas or clay. For Amara, that made her even more dangerous, because Ms. Vega, unlike the others, openly preached about honesty and authenticity. She had told the class once, almost proudly, that she was gay. She said it without shame, as if daring anyone to challenge her. The room had gone silent, but Vega had smiled as though she'd just given them all permission to live without fear. Amara remembered sitting there, watching her, and thinking, if only it were that easy. For Vega, truth was a shield. For Amara, truth was a prison, and she couldn't forgive the hypocrisy. It started on a Tuesday afternoon, when Amara lingered after art class. She stood before her unfinished canvas, brush hovering, her eyes distant. Vega noticed. "You've been distracted lately," she said gently. "Your work used to have so much life." Amara bit her lip as if holding back tears. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not allowed to be myself," she whispered. Those words were bait, and Vega took them instantly. She closed the classroom door, pulled up a chair beside Amara, and spoke in that soft, earnest tone she reserved for confessions. "You don't have to hide who you are. Not here. Not with me." Amara lowered her eyes, her voice trembling. "But what if the truth destroys me?" That line was carefully rehearsed, and it hit Vega like a challenge. She placed a hand on Amara's shoulder, squeezing lightly. "The truth doesn't destroy you, Amara. The lies do." Amara let silence stretch between them, her shoulders quivering just enough to suggest vulnerability. She knew Vega couldn't resist the role of savior, the chance to be the guide, the protector. Over the next week, Amara leaned into that dynamic. She stayed late in the studio, asked questions that seemed intimate, about love, about fear, about what it meant to be different. Vega answered every one, her guard slowly slipping. One evening, as the sun dipped low and golden light spilled across canvases, Amara broke down in practiced sobs. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said, her face buried in her hands. Vega knelt beside her, trying to soothe her, whispering that she wasn't alone. When Amara lifted her face, streaked with tears, their eyes locked. The kiss happened quickly, Vega crossing the line she had sworn she never would. For Vega, it was a moment of compassion turned into something forbidden. For Amara, it was the moment the trap snapped shut. They met again the following night. The studio smelled of turpentine and fresh paint, but it might as well have been smoke and mirrors. When it was over, Amara sat quietly on the stool, her eyes fixed on a half-finished painting of a faceless woman. "There's something I should tell you," she murmured, her voice almost tender. Vega smiled, brushing hair from Amara's face. "What is it?" Amara's words came slow, deliberate, each syllable a blade. "I'm HIV positive." The color drained from Vega's face. She pulled back as though she'd been struck. "What?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Amara didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. The silence was enough. She simply stood, gathered her things, and walked out, leaving Vega frozen in the fading light. That night, Vega sat alone in her apartment, staring at her hands as though they no longer belonged to her. Her chest tightened with panic, her mind racing through consequences, her career, her reputation, the betrayal of the students who trusted her. Everything she had built on the foundation of living authentically suddenly felt like a lie. She had crossed the very boundary she told herself she never would. And now, the secret she thought was strength had become her greatest weakness. At school the next day, Vega tried to compose herself. She instructed students to sketch still lives, her voice measured, her posture stiff. But her eyes betrayed her. They darted toward Amara again and again, as though trying to read whether she had told anyone, whether her secret was already unraveling. Amara never looked back. She painted in silence, her brushstrokes steady, her face serene. For Amara, the satisfaction wasn't in the act itself. It was in the aftermath. Watching someone who claimed to live without fear suddenly choke on it. Watching the cracks spread across a mask of self-righteousness until it began to crumble. She knew Vega would eat herself alive with guilt and paranoia, just like Dalton, just like Miller. And that was enough. Another mask shattered. Another life snared in her web. And Amara felt her power growing. Mr. Odessa was not like Dalton or Miller or even Vega. He wasn't reckless, and he didn't wear his flaws out in the open. To most people at Boston High, he was a respectable history teacher in his early 40s, tall and soft-spoken, with a Nigerian lilt in his voice that made his lectures sound almost like stories. Students liked him because he treated them like adults. Colleagues respected him because he carried himself with quiet dignity. But Amara had noticed the cracks, hairline fractures in the facade he worked so hard to maintain. She saw the way he slipped off his wedding ring before staff meetings, how his eyes dimmed whenever his phone lit up with his wife's name. She heard the whispers from the teacher's lounge about a marriage falling apart, and she knew loneliness when she saw it. That loneliness was her way in. It began after class one rainy afternoon. Most of the students had already filed out, their sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floors, but Amara lingered, pretending to gather her books slowly. "Mr. Odessa," she said quietly, "do you ever feel like history just repeats itself? No matter how hard people try to change." The question was vague, almost innocent, but he looked at her with startled eyes, as though she had brushed against a truth too close to his own. Sometimes, he admitted, but history also teaches us that people can learn from mistakes, that cycles can be broken. She smiled faintly, letting silence hang in the air before she whispered, "Not always." Then she slipped out of the room, leaving him unsettled. Over the next week, she came back with more questions, not about textbooks or dates, but about choices, morality, the weight of secrets. Questions that blurred the line between student and confidant. And Mr. Odessa, tired, weary, desperate for someone to listen, let his guard down. He began sharing pieces of himself he had never meant to reveal. The fights at home, the feeling of being invisible in his own house, the crushing weight of being a man who could quote history's greatest revolutions but couldn't fix the collapse of his own marriage. Amara listened with the patience of a priest, nodding, her eyes soft with false empathy. "You're not alone," she told him one evening when the classroom was empty, the rain tapping at the windows. "Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone gets lost." He sighed, his shoulders sagging. "But I'm supposed to know better. I'm supposed to set an example." "That doesn't mean you're not human," she whispered, reaching out, letting her hand graze his. It was a fleeting touch, just long enough to send a shock through him, just long enough to open the door wider. The line, once crossed, was impossible to redraw. They met again the following evening, when the halls were quiet and the school nearly empty. Their encounter wasn't fast or reckless like Miller's, nor soaked in false romance like Dalton's. It was heavy, tinged with guilt before it even began. Odessa kissed her like a man drowning, desperate for air, desperate for something to fill the void his marriage no longer could. Afterward, as he sat at his desk with his head in his hands, she studied him the way she studied her sketches. Here was a man who believed himself righteous, reduced to trembling hands and whispered apologies. She let him sit in that shame for a moment before she spoke. "There's something you should know," she said quietly, her voice steady. When she told him, "I'm HIV positive," the blood drained from his face. His breath hitched, his eyes widening in disbelief. You're lying," he stammered, his accent thickening with panic. She only shook her head. "Why would I lie about something like that?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Odessa pressed his palms together, muttering fragments of prayers under his breath, as if God could rewind time, erase the choices that had brought him here. Amara watched him crumble, and inside, she felt the same cold satisfaction she had felt with Dalton, with Miller, with Vega. Another mask shattered. Another figure of authority revealed for what he truly was: weak, flawed, human. In the days that followed, Odessa carried himself like a man walking underwater. His lectures faltered, his once commanding voice now shaky, distracted. Students noticed. Colleagues noticed. He avoided eye contact with Amara in class, his hands fidgeting with his wedding ring, slipping it on and off like a nervous tick. His guilt weighed on him like an anchor, dragging him further down every time their eyes accidentally met. Amara, meanwhile, moved through the hallways with calm precision. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to remind him. The silence was enough. Fear would do the rest. By the end of the week, Mr. Odessa looked like a man aged 10 years. His shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. And Amara knew the truth. She hadn't just infected him with a virus that haunted her own blood. She had infected him with fear, with shame, with the knowledge that everything he'd built, his marriage, his reputation, his role as a teacher, was one whisper away from collapse. Another secret conquered, another life unraveling. And Amara was just getting stronger. Principal Carter had ruled Boston High for over a decade. To parents, he was the face of authority. Polished suits, calm speeches at assemblies, firm handshakes at PTA meetings. To students, he was something else entirely. Rumors trailed him like shadows. Whispers of closed-door meetings with girls who suddenly transferred schools, of favors exchanged for silence. Nothing had ever been proven, of course. Men like Carter were experts at keeping their reputation spotless. But Amara had been watching, and she knew the rumors weren't just smoke. There was fire beneath them. He was her ultimate target, the man at the top, the one whose downfall would echo the loudest. Amara didn't approach him with vulnerability the way she had with Dalton or Odessa, nor with admiration like she had with Miller. With Carter, she played the part of someone ambitious, hungry for approval. She lingered after assemblies, asked questions about leadership, dropped hints that she wanted letters of recommendation. She flattered him in ways that made his chest puff with pride. He liked being seen as a mentor, a kingmaker. She made him feel powerful. One afternoon, she stopped by his office under the pretense of discussing college applications. The blinds were drawn, as they often were, and the faint smell of his cologne clung to the air. Carter gestured for her to sit, smiling that politician smile that never reached his eyes. "You're a smart girl, Amara," he said smoothly, folding his hands on the desk. "Someone like you could go very far. But colleges don't just look at grades. They look at character, initiative, connections." Amara tilted her head, feigning innocence. "And you can help with that?" His smile widened. "I can open doors others can't, if you show me you're serious." The line hung in the air, dripping with implication. Amara didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "I'm serious." That was all it took. Carter leaned back in his chair, eyes gleaming with the confidence of a man who had gotten away with this too many times before. He thought he was the one pulling the strings. He didn't know Amara had already set the stage. Their encounter was deliberate, orchestrated by her every move. She let him believe he was seducing her, that he was in control, when in truth he was stepping into the same trap as the others. By the time the office door clicked shut, the outcome was inevitable. Afterward, Carter poured himself a glass of whiskey from the cabinet in the corner, a satisfied grin plastered across his face. He adjusted his tie, as though nothing had happened, as though this was just another secret to bury with the rest. Amara stood by the window, gazing out at the schoolyard where students were laughing, oblivious. "You should probably know something," she said softly, her back still to him. He chuckled, swirling the glass. "What's that?" She turned then, her eyes sharp, her voice cutting through the room like ice. "I'm HIV positive." The glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. For the first time in her life, Amara saw fear flash across his face. Not just fear, pure panic. He stammered, demanded to know if she was serious, threatened her with consequences if she was lying. But Amara only held his gaze, unblinking, her silence louder than any answer. Carter sank into his chair, his hands trembling. His carefully constructed mask, the authoritative principal, the man of control, crumbled in seconds. He muttered under his breath, his mind racing through the fallout. Exposure. Scandal. His career annihilated. His family destroyed. His health in jeopardy. For once, he wasn't the one holding power. The next day at school, Carter tried to carry on as usual. He stood at the podium during morning announcements, his voice booming through the intercom. But Amara saw the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes darted nervously across the auditorium. Every laugh from a student, every glance from a teacher, made him wonder, did they know? Had she told them? His paranoia was a living thing, gnawing at him from the inside. Amara walked past his office that afternoon, meeting his eyes through the half-open door. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The silence between them was enough to make him flinch. For Amara, Carter wasn't just another victory. He was proof that no one, not even a man at the top, was beyond reach. Each conquest had made her stronger, more certain. And now, with all five trapped in her web, she felt the weight of her revenge settle like armor around her shoulders. But somewhere, deep in the silence after the adrenaline faded, a new feeling began to stir. It wasn't triumph. It was something colder, heavier. A whisper of the consequences she had unleashed, not just on them, but on herself. The tension inside Boston High had been building for weeks, invisible but undeniable. 5 adults, once so certain of their authority, now moved through the halls like ghosts. Mr. Dalton's lectures had lost their rhythm, his eyes darting nervously toward Amara whenever she raised her hand. Coach Miller barked at his team louder than ever, but his voice cracked under the weight of sleepless nights. Ms. Vega barely touched her paintbrush anymore, her hands trembling as she handed out supplies. Mr. Adissa looked broken, his once commanding posture sagging, his wedding ring spinning endlessly between his fingers. And Principal Carter, once untouchable, now stumbled through his speeches, his once polished words suddenly fragile. Amara watched it all in silence. The school buzzed with rumors, students sensing something off in the adults who were supposed to guide them. Whispers floated through the cafeteria. Why was Mr. Dalton so pale? Why did Coach Miller leave in the middle of practice? Why did Ms. Vega cry in the bathroom? No one had answers. Only Amara knew the truth. She had spun this web, and now she stood in the center of it, watching her prey thrash. But power is a heavy thing to carry, and the weight of it began pressing on her chest. At night, lying awake, she imagined not just the teachers, but their families, their spouses, their children, lives unraveling from a single truth she had delivered. Fear and guilt mingled inside her until they became indistinguishable. Revenge had given her purpose, but now that purpose was rotting into something darker. It all came to a head one gray Wednesday afternoon. Carter had called a private meeting in his office, summoning Dalton, Miller, Vega, and Adissa. The blinds were drawn tight, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and sweat. They sat in a circle of tension, each one shifting in their seat, eyes avoiding each other. Amara was called in last. When she stepped inside, all eyes turned to her, the girl who had been the common thread in their unraveling. Carter cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. Amara, we need to talk. There have been concerns, questions, whispers. Dalton leaned forward, his voice sharp, desperate. What did you tell them? Miller's jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists on his knees. Vega's eyes glistened, her breathing shallow. Adissa muttered a prayer under his breath, sweat beading on his forehead. Amara stood in the center of the room, the walls closing in on her. She could feel their fear, their anger, their desperation pressing down like a storm. And suddenly, the words poured out of her. Not carefully planned, not manipulated, but raw, unfiltered truth. You want to know? She said, her voice shaking but loud enough to fill the room. Fine, I'll tell you everything. She told them about the day she sat in the nurse's office, staring at the word positive on her test result. She told them about her mother, about the night nearly 2 decades ago that had left her with a virus she never asked for. She told them about the lies, the silence, the years of growing up in the dark. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. I was angry, she confessed, her fists trembling at her sides. I wanted someone else to feel the pain I've lived with my whole life. All of you were easy targets. You pretended to be role models, protectors, but you were already standing on an edge. I just pushed you over. The room was silent, save for the sound of ragged breathing. Dalton looked as if he might be sick. Miller stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tight. Vega's tears spilled freely now, her face pale as chalk. Adissa shook his head slowly, whispering, "God forgive us." Carter, for the first time, looked powerless, his hands gripping the edge of his desk like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Amara's voice softened, the rage draining out of her until only exhaustion remained. "I didn't just hurt you. I hurt your families, your futures, people who never deserved it. And I can't take it back." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Carter, his voice low and hoarse, said, "Do you understand what you've done?" Amara met his eyes. "Yes. And that's why I'm telling you now. The truth. All of it." The door opened then, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Someone, maybe Carter, maybe one of the others, had called them ahead of time. Amara didn't resist as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. She didn't cry. She didn't fight. As they led her out of the office, past the stunned faces of the teachers she had destroyed, she felt strangely calm. The secret was no longer hers to bear alone. In the hallways outside, the muffled sounds of students laughing and lockers slamming filled the air. Life at Boston High carried on, unaware that behind one closed office door, a storm had just broken. And for Amara, the game was over. But the consequences, those were only beginning. The news of Amara's arrest spread through Boston High like wildfire. By the next morning, every hallway buzzed with speculation. Students huddled in corners, whispering her name as if it were a curse, while teachers tried and failed to keep order in classrooms now thick with rumor. Phones lit up with texts and group chats. Screenshots of Amara being let out in handcuffs circulated within hours. Some kids called her a monster. Others called her a legend. But no one could ignore her. For the 5 adults at the center of it, the aftermath was immediate and brutal. Mr. Dalton didn't show up for class the next day. His absence was explained away as personal leave, but everyone knew something was wrong. Within a week, he quietly resigned, his reputation shattered. Coach Miller tried to keep coaching the team, but his rage boiled over in practice, and parents began demanding answers. Whispers turned to shouts until the school board suspended him indefinitely. Ms. Vega, once the face of Boston High's arts program, avoided eye contact with everyone. When the district placed her on leave pending investigation, she disappeared overnight, leaving her classroom a graveyard of half-finished paintings. Mr. Adissa seemed to crumble the fastest. He walked into class the day after Amara's confession, looking pale, exhausted, his voice shaking through his lecture. By the end of the week, he simply stopped showing up. Students joked that he'd had a breakdown, but the truth was darker. His marriage was imploding, and his world was collapsing under the weight of his guilt. And then there was Principal Carter. The man who had ruled the school with iron authority was suddenly the subject of investigation, his polished exterior stripped away. Parents demanded his removal. The district complied. Carter was forced to resign, his fall from grace complete. The community was outraged. Parents filled the auditorium for emergency meetings, shouting at school officials, demanding to know how such a thing could happen under their noses. News vans parked outside the gates, reporters jostling for soundbites from anyone willing to speak. The headlines were merciless. High school HIV scandal rocks Boston community. Editorials debated who was more to blame, the teachers who crossed the line or the girl who weaponized her illness. Clara Lewis, meanwhile, sat alone in her apartment, staring at her daughter's empty bedroom. The police had questioned her, the press had hounded her, and she had no answers to give. Neighbors who once nodded politely now looked at her with suspicion, even disgust. She wanted to scream the truth, that her daughter was not a monster, but a victim, a child born into a nightmare she had no choice in. But guilt silenced her. After all, hadn't her silence built the foundation for this tragedy? Amara herself was held in juvenile detention, isolated in a gray cinder block cell that smelled of bleach and despair. She didn't fight, didn't scream. She sat quietly, staring at the ceiling, the same way she had the night she first learned the truth. The officers treated her like a criminal, but in her mind, she was still something more complicated, part villain, part victim. She had wanted power, and for a brief moment, she'd had it. But power, she realized now, always came with a cost. Psychologists were brought in almost immediately. They called her detached, calculating, but also deeply wounded. Some said she needed treatment, not punishment. Others insisted she was dangerous. Prosecutors weighed their options, unsure whether to try her as a juvenile or push for harsher charges. The courtroom would eventually decide her fate, but in the eyes of the public, her trial had already begun. At Boston High, the fallout left scars that would never heal. Students spoke of her like a ghost, someone who had once walked their halls but now existed as a warning. Teachers whispered about resignations and retirements. The school board scrambled to salvage its reputation, implementing new policies, stricter boundaries, mandatory training. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. And through it all, Amara's name became a symbol. To some, she was a cautionary tale about unchecked anger and revenge. To others, she was proof of the rot that had festered under the surface of institutions people trusted blindly. For the families torn apart, for the careers destroyed, there were no easy answers. In the silence of her cell, Amara finally allowed herself a bitter smile. The game was over, yes, but its echoes were only just beginning to spread. The courthouse was packed the morning Amara Lewis first appeared in front of Judge. News crews lined the steps, cameras flashing as she was led inside in an oversized orange jumpsuit, wrists cuffed, her face expressionless. The crowd outside was divided. Some jeered, calling her a monster. Others whispered that she was a victim of circumstances bigger than herself. Boston had seen scandals before, but nothing like this. An 18-year-old girl accused of infecting 5 of her own teachers with HIV. Inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. The prosecution painted Amara as calculating, manipulative, and dangerous. They spoke of how she had deliberately targeted figures of authority, seducing them, drawing them into her web, and then dropping the truth like a guillotine. She knew what she was doing, the prosecutor told the jury. This wasn't impulsive. It was methodical. It was revenge. But the defense countered with a story just as compelling. They spoke of her childhood, the crime against her mother, the silence that had wrapped around her life like barbed wire. They argued that Amara wasn't a predator, but a child born into trauma, forced to carry a virus she never asked for. She is not the disease, her lawyer insisted, voice breaking. She is the product of secrecy, of pain, of being denied the truth until it shattered her. The teachers were called to testify, one by one. One by one, the teachers confessed, Dalton, Miller, Vega, Adissa, even Principal Carter. Each testimony stripped away their reputations and left their careers in ruins. The jury didn't only hear about Amara's actions. They heard about the culture of Boston High, the blurred boundaries, the rumors that had circulated for years without consequence. For many watching, it became less about Amara alone and more about the entire system that had failed its students and its staff. The courtroom became a mirror, forcing the community to see what had been festering in the shadows. When Amara herself finally took the stand, the room went silent. She didn't cry, didn't beg. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. She spoke of the day she learned she was HIV positive, of her anger at her mother, of her loneliness, her sense of betrayal. She admitted she wanted others to feel the same fear she lived with every day. But I never wanted to kill anyone, she said softly. I just wanted them to know what it feels like to lose control of your own life. Her words cut deep. Some jurors looked at her with pity, others with disgust. The courtroom was split between those who saw a cunning manipulator and those who saw a broken girl. After 2 weeks of testimony, the verdict came down. The jury found Amara guilty of reckless endangerment, intentional exposure, and statutory misconduct, but not guilty of attempted murder. The distinction mattered. It acknowledged her intent to harm without framing her as a cold-blooded killer. The judge's sentencing was just as complex. "You are young," he told her, "but youth does not erase responsibility. Your actions have changed lives forever." He sentenced Amara to 6 years in a juvenile correctional facility, with mandatory counseling and community service focused on HIV education once released. The courtroom erupted, some outraged at the leniency, others relieved she would not spend her life behind bars. The teachers left the stand in silence, their careers in ruins. Clara, sitting in the back row, wept quietly into her hands, torn between grief and a strange, fragile hope. As Amara was led away, she glanced back at the gallery. For the first time, her face softened. The trial had ended, but her story was far from over. The world now knew her name, her secret, her scars. The punishment was set. The question that lingered was whether she would ever find redemption beyond it. 5 years later, the name Amara Lewis still lingered in Boston like a scar that refused to fade. For some, it was a reminder of betrayal, of a scandal that toppled careers and stained a school's reputation. For others, it was a story of survival, of a young woman who clawed her way back from darkness. At 23, Amara walked out of the juvenile facility not in handcuffs, but with a second chance. Her time behind walls had been brutal at first. Lonely nights in a cement cell, whispers from other inmates who called her the HIV girl, guards who looked at her like she was radioactive. But somewhere in those years, she changed. Counseling sessions forced her to face the choices she had made, to sift through the wreckage of anger and guilt. She learned the language of accountability, the power of admitting harm while still acknowledging pain. And slowly, she found a purpose she had never known before. Instead of running from her story, she began to tell it. Community groups invited her to speak. Health advocates asked her to share her experience. Standing in front of classrooms and auditoriums, she would begin the same way. "My name is Amara Lewis. I was born HIV positive, and I made choices that hurt people because I didn't know how to live with that truth." Her voice carried not bitterness, but clarity. She talked about stigma, about secrecy, about what happens when silence festers until it turns toxic. The teachers she had once ensnared had scattered. Dalton lived quietly in another state, barred from teaching. Miller disappeared from the coaching world, his once promising career reduced to rumors. Vega worked at a small gallery out of town, avoiding questions about her past. Adissa returned to Nigeria, his marriage gone, his reputation shattered. And Carter, the once powerful principal, lived in near isolation, a man remembered not for his leadership, but for his disgrace. None of them had fully recovered, but all of them had been forced to confront the fragility of their masks. Clara Lewis aged in those 5 years, her face lined with sorrow and regret. Yet when Amara walked through the door of their small apartment on release day, mother and daughter held each other for the first time without secrets between them. Forgiveness didn't come all at once, but in small moments, shared dinners, quiet conversations, the simple act of sitting together without lies. The scandal of Boston High had ignited national debates about HIV, about power dynamics, about what responsibility looks like when both predator and victim blur together. National talk shows dissected the case, opinion columns filled newspapers, and advocacy groups marched in Boston and Washington demanding reform. Hashtags with Amara's name trended for weeks, sparking fiery debates across social media and cable news that in the years that followed, Boston schools, and many across the country, introduced stricter policies on teacher-student boundaries. New mandatory training sessions were created, and Amara's story even appeared in academic journals as a case study in ethics and institutional failure. Her name became shorthand in debates about consent, secrecy, and accountability. To some, Amara would always be a cautionary tale. To others, she became a symbol of what happens when society hides its ugliest truths instead of facing them. One spring evening, Amara stood on a stage in front of a packed college auditorium, the lights hot against her skin. She looked out at the sea of faces, young, curious, afraid, and told them the story she once thought would destroy her. She spoke of pain, of revenge, of consequences. And then she spoke of something else, resilience. "I can't change what I did," she said, her voice steady. "But I can use it to make sure no one else grows up believing their only weapon is their own suffering. Silence can kill. Truth can save." The crowd rose in applause, some with tears in their eyes. Amara closed hers for a moment, breathing in the sound, the warmth, the proof that her voice could be more than a weapon. It could be a bridge. The girl who once turned her illness into vengeance was gone. In her place stood a woman, scarred but unbroken, carrying the weight of her past into a future she was finally ready to build.